Welcome to PG Music Producer Secrets. Let's mix some drum stems. In Band-in-a-Box 2022, many of our real drums now have an option to load their drum stems. This means that you can load the individual microphone recordings of each drum as opposed to having a pre-made stereo mix of the drums. As a result, you'll have much more freedom to personalize the sound of the drums to your taste with things like volume, pan, reverb, EQ, and plugins. My main goal in this video is to show you how to make a desirable drum sound with drum stems within Band-in-a-Box using the PG plugin suite that's included with Band-in-a-Box. This way, anyone with Band-in-a-Box 2022 will be able to follow this tutorial step by step. You may prefer to export the stems and mix them in your own DAW, or mix them within Band-in-a-Box with different plugins, which I encourage you to do as well. If you want to follow along, you can download the zip file that I've linked to in the description. Make sure the SGU, STY, and STX files are in the same directory, then open the SGU file in Band-in-a-Box. Please note that there are many approaches to mixing drums, and I'm just going to show you one approach that combines conventional wisdom with my own production secrets. If you have any advice or questions, then please feel free to comment down below. And if you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, let's get started. The first step is to load or start a new project and load the real drum stems. If you followed the link in the description, you should already have a project that you can use. It'll look exactly like the one that I have up right now. I've already loaded the real drum stems in this project to save you time. But let's say you wanted to start a new project at a different point in time and you wanted to have real drum stems loaded. I'll show you how to do that now. So I'll start a new project. I'll go to Real Drums Picker Dialog, and you can actually sort by stems available in each real drum style. So if you go to the stems column and you sort by that, so the little star is up there or the asterisk, then it'll show you how many are available. In this demonstration, I'm going to use Americana Funky Pop Fred, and if I put a check mark beside all stems, it will load all of the available stems for this real drum style. Now, in some cases, you might not want to load all of them. You might just want to load the snare, the kick, and the mix so that you can have control over the kick and snare, for example. But for this demonstration, we're going to load all of the stems, and after you hit the all stems checkbox, you can just hit OK, and it will load them all here. Alright, so I'm going to go back to that project file that I had up. And the first thing we're going to do is set the volume levels. Now, as a starting point, I'm going to set the kick and the snare so that they're going up sort of to the top of the green section in the VU meters. It's okay if they cross over a little bit into the yellow, but the reason we aim for that as a peak is because you don't want clipping, and this will give us a sufficient amount of headroom so we don't need to worry about that. So I'll adjust the volumes for those ones first, and I'll do that by playing the song and soloing them. Okay, so I'm going to turn this one up a little bit. That's about right, I think. And then we're going to add in the top snare mic. And I'm also going to set that one to 105. I think that's about a good level for that. And let's bring in the snare bottom too. And I'm going to adjust the volume for this based on how much of that sort of higher frequency snare springs snap and sound that I want. And that's about where I want it, at an 85. Okay, now let's bring in the hi-hat overhead. And you can hear that's bringing in quite a bit of snare. So there's a bit of snare bleed in that microphone, and so I'm going to set it down a little bit to around 75. And then for the ride overhead, we're going to set that down a little bit too. That's also getting a bit of snare. So yeah, I think 70 is about a good level for that. Now let's see if we can hear the volume of the rack toms and the floor toms sort of in the fill areas. Okay, yeah, I heard them both in that fill, so I'm going to set them up a little bit here to 100 for the floor tom, and I'm actually going to lower this one a little bit to 85. And those should be some good basic levels to get started with. Now you may notice that all of these are pan center right now, and at some point we're going to have to pan our overheads to create a stereo image from those, and we're going to add a bit of pan to our floor tom and rack tom as well. The kick and the snare are often panned either center or close to center. The next thing we're going to do is start processing these drum stems on an individual basis, and the first track that I want to work on is the kick drum. So I'll solo that track. Next I'll go to the plugins tab and I'll click on the first plugin slot, go to choose plugin, and I want to select PG Dynamics and click OK. Okay, so here's the PG Dynamics plugin. This essentially has two effects, an expander / gate and a compressor. We're going to use both of them, but we're going to set the expander / gate first, so I'll uncheck the compressor.
Sorry, no.
An expander is an audio effect that lowers the volume of audio when it's under a certain volume threshold. This means that it reduces the volume of quiet sounds. It's similar to a gate, but it's more flexible because it can lower the volume instead of eliminating it completely. The main controls on an expander are threshold, ratio, attack, and release. Some expanders may have additional settings, like hold, that allow you to shape the effect more precisely. I'll explain what the parameters do while I'm using them. Okay, so in order to set the levels for the expander / gate, I'm going to start playing the song, and I'll have the kick drum soloed, so that's all we hear, and I'll set the threshold. Now the threshold of the expander / gate determines at what volume sound is let through. So if we set it to a really low level, like -96, it will let everything over -96 decibels through, so that it's doing nothing, almost nothing right now. And as we turn it up, if we turn it up all the way, it lets no sound through because our signal level's never surpassing 0 decibels. So we want to set it somewhere in between so that the kick drum is getting through, but the background drum sounds that are just bleeding from other mics are not getting through. So I'll set this back a little bit here. And it's okay if a tiny bit gets through. The main thing is we don't want to take out any of the kick drum. And we want to limit the rest of the bleed as much as possible without being invasive. So next I will set the ratio, and I'm going to set the ratio to around 3.24. The ratio controls how much the sound is reduced when it goes under that threshold. Now, as you can see here, because I've set the ratio where I have, it's only ever going down to about here. And that's perfect. We don't need to completely take out that sound. We just need to minimize it enough. And again, we're focusing on not being too invasive on the original audio. Now for attack, I need to set that really low so that it catches the very beginning of the attack of the kick drum and lets it through. If we were to set it later, it would start missing the attack. So you can see it's sort of a whooshy attack now, and we don't want that. So we'll leave that at 0. And next we're going to work on the release. Now the release determines how long it waits after you cross that threshold until it starts eliminating the sound again. And in this case, we don't want that value to be very high. We can actually control how the drum sort of sounds by manipulating this value, because if we set it to a lower value, it gives the drum less decay. Now if you have a kick drum sound that's ringing out a lot, that'll be really useful, and you can set the release lower. Okay, so you can hear that the kick drum's always getting through, but the other sounds are sort of being minimized. They're not being 100% eliminated, but that's okay. Next, we're going to work on the compressor. A compressor is an audio effect that lowers the volume of audio when it's over a certain volume threshold. This means that it reduces the volume of loud sounds. It's similar to a limiter, but is more flexible because it can curve the highest points of your waveform instead of chopping them off completely. The main parameters that a compressor has are threshold, ratio, attack, and release. I'll explain what the parameters do while I'm using them. So with the compressor, the threshold has sort of a similar function to the one in the expander/gate, except it's inverted, meaning when the signal of your audio crosses a certain volume, it will start to then reduce the volume instead of reducing the volume when it's under a certain threshold. So if I reduce this all the way, the compressor is being activated at minus 96 decibels, which means that it's being activated almost all the time, which essentially is crushing our sound all the way and gives us no signal. Now, inversely, I can turn it all the way up, and it's almost never being activated now because the signal has to get to minus 4, minus 5 decibels before the compressor is activated. So what we want to do is find a value somewhere in between. I'm going to set it probably around here, and I can actually monitor these values better if I disable the expander gate right now, because it'll show me how much it's compressing in the monitors over here. Okay, so it's actually compressing it a little bit more than I want. Let's set it to minus 19. That should be a good value. And now I have to set the ratio. So the ratio determines how much the volume is reduced after it crosses that threshold. So if it got 5 decibels louder after crossing that threshold before, and I set a ratio of 2, then the 5 decibels would become 2.5 decibels. So it's essentially cutting the volume by 50% over that threshold. I find for drums, usually you want a slightly higher threshold because you want some better control over what they're doing, and often that's around 8 to 1. So I'll set it, 7.75 is fine. And next I want to set the attack. Now, how you set the attack really depends on what you want to do with the compressor. If you want to use it more like a limiter where you're always controlling the volume of the attacks, then you want this closer to 0. And that will catch everything that hits it. You can also use that to control how the attack of the drum sounds and to give it a bit of a crisper sort of attack. And that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm actually going to set it a little higher, something like 15 is fine. And that just lets a little bit of volume sneak through at the very beginning, and that gives me sort of like a little blip of volume that gives me a sharper attack. Now for the release, if you want a very consistent volume reduction that reduces the volume sort of the entire waveform, you would set it to a higher value. And the advantage of that is it'll maintain the integrity of the original waveform. But if you want to use the compressor to increase perceived volume, then you'll want to bring this value down a little bit. And specifically here, I'm going to set it to around 145. Or 159 is fine. And that means that the decay of that drum, or the sustain, will still be at a louder volume. That part won't be crushed. It's just sort of the beginning portion when crossing that threshold that is affected. So now I'll bring the expander gate back in because I don't need to monitor those levels anymore. They're sort of where I want them. Okay, and that's exactly how we want that kick drum to sound right now. Next, I'm going to put this plugin up here and I'm going to add an equalizer into the next plugin slot. An EQ, or equalizer, is an audio effect that allows you to add or subtract volume from specific audio frequencies. The human ear can hear frequencies as low as 20 Hz and as high as 20,000 Hz or 20 kHz. Hertz refers to cycles per second. A low frequency or low note resonates slowly, and a high frequency or high note resonates quickly. You'll find that some equalizers will have preset bands that center around commonly modified frequencies, while others will allow you to sweep the band freely and choose a frequency. Some equalizers have something called Q that allows you to reduce the frequency spectrum of the band to isolate specific frequencies, or increase the frequency spectrum to affect a wider range of frequencies. And the one we're going to use is the PG 10-band EQ. Okay, there it is. Now, if you're unsure about reference values for an equalizer, the best thing you can do is sweep the EQ. And when you sweep the EQ, you can sort of get a feeling for what each band sounds like, and you can decide if it's something you want to add or subtract. Okay, so that's obviously a very low frequency. Let's try one a little higher. That's more of a sort of woody sound, isn't it? Okay, so this is how you learn what these frequencies sound like and what they can do. That's a little bit more of a sort of attack, sort of the beater noise when it's attacking the drum head. So that's good to know as well, right? So explore this until you're comfortable with what they do. And right now, I'm also going to give you some conventional wisdom on EQs so that you have a starting point. So conventionally, what you would do is you'd go to the mid frequencies around 400 or 500 Hertz, and you'd reduce those a bit. I'm also gonna, because we don't have a 400 Hertz, I'm gonna lower down the next one. And so the kick drum has a lot of mid frequency in it, and we're gonna try to pull it out and accent some different things. Also, traditionally, you could up the lower frequencies, since this is playing a bassy role in our mix, usually around 50 Hertz, but because we don't have a 50 Hertz, a 63 will do fine. And also, like I was mentioning before, the sort of principal noise of the beater hitting the skin of the drum is sort of between 1 and 2K, so I'm going to up those frequencies as well. Now, for higher frequencies, some people will use a high shelf, which sort of increases all the frequencies after a certain frequency. And that's because it'll give you more of a click, and it'll cut through the mix and give you an attack on your kick drum. You can also decide on a specific frequency that you want to up in order to create that click. And in this case, I'm going to choose 8K. And you can hear that's giving it sort of that clicky quality that will sort of cut through the mix. And now I'm just going to sort of modify this a bit, sort of tune it, listen to the drum, and just make it exactly how I want it. So stay tuned. Okay, so I'm done with the EQ now. You may notice that we've accentuated the lower and the higher frequencies to sort of bring the kick drum out, and so it's not lumped together too much with the other instruments in the mix. Now, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add a plugin that controls the overall volume of this, so it's always peaking at the same maximum level. Now, if the player was to hit the drum a little softer, there will still be a little bit of dynamic play in that, but assuming they're hitting it at the consistent sort of max volume, we want that to always peak at the same place so that we're controlling our overall mix and we have more potential to raise the volume of our overall mix later. You can see here that drums with a limiter on the kick and snare always peak at the same volume, and this predictability ultimately allows you to increase the volume of your overall mix without experiencing clipping. Typically you would use a limiter for this, and there is a plugin for that. There is a PG, where is it here? PG peak limit. I tried that plugin before, and I think there's something about the attack that is letting some volume through there and not controlling it properly. But there's another plugin that I found that'll work very well for us, and that is the PG distortion plugin. Now, you might think that's a little bit crazy because you don't necessarily want distortion on a kick drum. In some very specific cases you might want distortion, but usually not. And what we're going to actually do is use this plugin as a limiter, and we're going to turn down the input so it's not giving us any distortion. You can see if we turn it up, it would give us distortion, but we're going to leave it fairly low, between 6 and 12. And then we're going to bring down the output volume of that to between 6 and 8. So we're sort of at that similar level we were at before, but as you can see, it's peaking at almost exactly the same place now, and that's really what we want. Okay, so we've modified our kick drum exactly how we want it, and the next drum we're going to focus on is the snare drum. There are two different tracks dedicated to the snare in our mixer. One is for snare and one is for snare bottom. The regular snare microphone here is actually the top snare microphone, and that captures more of the initial percussive hit of the stick hitting the skin of the drum, and you'll hear more of the pitch that the drum is tuned to, whereas the bottom snare microphone is meant to capture the snare springs, which expand across the bottom of the drum, and those capture more sort of like a higher frequency spectrum, and the sound is sort of similar to white noise. Okay, so we're going to mix the top snare microphone first, and we're going to add a plugin. We're going to use the same PG Dynamics plugin that we used before, and I'll just pull it over here. Now you'll notice that I left the plugins for the kick drum up here, and that's so after I add more of the microphones to the drums in, I can easily modify what I've done there if I think it's not sounding right anymore. So on the snare track, we're first going to deal with the expander. And so I'll start playing the song with the snare track soloed. And you can hear that there's a little bit of hi-hat in there, there's a little bit of kick drum. And we're going to reduce that a little bit, but we also want to make sure that those softer sort of ghost notes that are hit on the snare aren't taken out of the mix. So we're going to use a bit of a gentle threshold here. I'm going to set it to around -22, and I'm going to set this to around 2.29 for the ratio. And then for the attack, we want to leave that quick like we did last time because it's a drum and we need this to let go of that volume decrease as soon as that drum is hit. So attack needs to be fast. For the release, we're going to actually increase this a little bit because this is going to control how much decay we're hearing on the snare. Because if the volume clamps down too fast, then you're not going to hear the nice decay from the top snare mic. So I think that's pretty good. There's still a little bit of bleed, but we're maintaining the integrity of the snare by letting those sort of ghost notes through as well. Now we're going to move on to the compressor. And I'm going to set the threshold for this. Oh, I need to disable auto gain because we want to leave that at 0. And now we're going to disable the expander gate. We can monitor the levels of the compressor. Okay, and we can see that sort of blip coming down. That's showing us how much volume is being reduced. And we're going to turn this up to just a little below 8. 8 is a common benchmark to use for drum compression. And that's maybe taking a little bit too much volume off the top. So let's increase the threshold so that on the weaker hits that are meant to be full hits, it's still reducing a tiny bit. But on the louder hits, it's sort of reducing those so that they're no louder than the other hits. And for the attack, I'm going to continue to let a little bit of the initial attack through here to create that sort of snappy snare sound. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want it to act more like a limiter and give you a precise, consistent level at the top, you want to put that down to 0 so it's catching the beginning of the attack. But in this case, I want it to introduce some snap by letting that first little bit of the attack through. Now, for the release, we're going to lower that quite a bit because we want to maintain the volume of the decay of the drum. And if that release is too high, then it's also going to crush the volume while the decay is happening after the attack. And we don't want that. We want that decay to be rich and present. And next we're going to add in an equalizer again, or an EQ. So we'll go back to the same PG 10 band EQ and load that. Okay, so like I mentioned before, if you don't have a reference point for the snare, then you can just experiment with the bands and listen to them, see what they sound like, decide what you like and what you want to subtract from the mix. In this case, I'm going to again give you some sort of conventional wisdom on EQing a snare. And so I'll play this again. And again, we're going to reduce the amount that we have in the mid-range here. And that's around 400 to 500 hertz. And because we don't have 400, I'm using a bit of the 250 instead. Now, there's a principal lower hit frequency around 150 to 200 hertz. In this case, it's very strong in this drum recording already, so I don't really want to enhance that. In fact, I'm going to bring it down a bit, and then I'm going to taper off on the lower frequencies here, because the snare doesn't do much around the lowest frequencies in the EQ, and so we don't need those in, and we don't want too much clutter from the other microphones, so we're taking that out. And finally, the crack of the snare is around 1.5 to 2K. So I'm going to add in a bit of crack of the snare there. And that's sort of because we have 1K and 2K. It's a balance between those two. And so we'll do both evenly. And again, some people use a high shelf on this. I'm not going to do that because we don't have it available. So instead, I'm going to sort of open this up so that we get a bit of airiness, a little bit of presence on the snare. And then I'm just going to continue, after using this as a starting point, I'm just going to continue to modify this a bit until it sounds exactly how I want it. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so the last plugin I'm going to add on the top snare track is the distortion plugin again. Now remember, we're using this as a limiter. We're not using it as a distortion. We'll load PG distortion. Okay, so let's play the snare sound again, and you can hear that's adding a lot of volume. I'm going to keep the pre-gain portion really low so that it's not introducing any distortion, And I'm gonna leave that between -4 and -6 dB. Okay, so we've mixed the snare top, and now we're gonna focus on the snare bottom. So let's solo that track, play the song again. And you can hear the unique sound of that snare spring. So for this one, we're going to use less processing. We're going to keep the processing light because it doesn't have as much of a dynamic range, because it's not the part of the drum where the actual percussive hit is taking place. So we're still going to add the PG Dynamics plugin, but we're going to use some gentler settings this time. Okay, so we have that up. Let's focus on the expander and gate first. Okay, setting the threshold to around -28. Setting the ratio to around 3, leaving the attack low. Setting the release a little higher so we let some of that decay through. Now we're going to work on the compressor. Disable that auto gain so we're not getting too much volume there. Set that to -19. Set the ratio not higher like we do with other drums, because again, this isn't the percussive portion of the drum. We're just doing something a little gentler here. The attack for this, because it's not a percussive attack, I don't need to capture that initial snap, so I'm going to leave that actually at 0. So it's just working more like a limiter on this track. And I'll leave the release lower so that we're still getting some of that decay coming through. That's not crushing with the compressor. Alright, so now that we have the kick and the snare set, I'm going to listen to both of them together. I'm just going to turn the kick drum down very slightly. Yeah, and I think that's a really nice, starting point for a kick and a snare drum. So the next thing that we're going to focus on now that we're done with the kick drum and the snare drum is the overheads. Now, the overheads are generally used to capture a stereo image of the drum kit. And there's generally 2 microphones that are used for this, although sometimes one is used. And they're usually in some kind of left and right pairing, whether they're used as a space pair, an XY pair, and a number of other configurations. This is very important in that it gives us that overall stereo image and expands the sound of the drums out laterally to the sides of the mix. So we're going to want to pan these microphones, and also keep in mind later that when you're mixing your floor tom and your rack tom in this case, you should listen to your overheads and listen to where those drums are in the stereo image and try to place them in a similar position to that in order to avoid phasing. If you're doing something more particular, or if you don't have too much the tom drums and the overheads, you can do something different. But as a general rule, it's good to listen to your overheads, listen to where the drums, the various drums in the kit are situated in a stereo layout, and try to sort of mimic that with how you pan the individual stems. Okay, let's start panning our overheads. And keep in mind that the maximum in Band in a Box is 63 and -63. So that's panned quite a bit to the left and right. And let's listen to them. Okay, so you're hearing more hi-hat to the right now. And if we go to the B section, we hear the ride cymbal kicking in, and that's to the left. So we've kind of placed those drums to the lateral mix, to the side mix, and that's perfect. You can also hear where the tom drums are if we go to. So they're sort of a little bit left of center, and so I'm going to start to pan those. Even though I'm not listening to those mics right now, I'm just going to give them an initial placement of -30 for the floor tom and -20 for the rack tom. Okay, and back to the overheads now. There's not a ton we need to do for these effect-wise because they're recorded from a distance from the actual drum, so there's not going to be as much volume variance, as much dynamic range in them. Let's just add back in the kick and the snare to hear a drum sound. Yeah, so you can hear that's really coming together, and with the processing we've added on the kick and snare and the stereo imaging we're creating, we're almost at a full drum mix now. In fact, the only thing we have left is the tom drums to mix in, and we'll do that with the rack tom first. We've panned that to -20. You can set part markers at every bar and you'll hear a bunch of drum fills, and that'll allow you to mix the tom drums more easily. What I usually do is I just skip ahead to the last bar before a part marker and listen to those fills, and that's how I gauge how the tom drums are sounding. So the first plugin that we're going to add on the rack tom is the PG Dynamics plugin again. So I'll select that and I'll move it down here so it's out of the way. Right, so it's a microphone that's not used very often, but it's still very important that we have the right dynamics on it. So I know that we're going to want the expander threshold around -14. One sec here. Okay, and for the ratio, around 4.2 is good. Attack. We want that always at 0 for the drums, and we're gonna place the release at 270, which will give us a little bit of the ringing of the tom drums, but not too much that it'll be invasive. Okay, that's a good tom drum sound. On to the compressor. Again, I'm gonna disable the auto gain, and we'll leave that. Actually, -12 should be good for that, but we'll put the ratio high again because this is a very percussive drum with more dynamic range. Right, so you can already hear that compressor taking effect. And I'm going to set the attack to 0 because I'm using more of a limiting effect with this compressor. And I'm going to set the release to around 300. And it's going to go a little bit into, it's going to affect the decay a little bit, and that's what we want. We want a little bit of decay, but not too much. And we're going to, leave that gain at 0, and that should be good. So let's hear it again. Okay, so nice and controlled. Okay, that's good. And let's look at the compressor levels. Okay, so it's not actually catching it. There, it's catching it a little too much. Okay, maybe even a little higher than that. Maybe -15. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to work on the floor tom drum. So let's solo that track. Let's choose a plugin. We'll choose PG Dynamics again. And I'm essentially just going to copy what I did more or less for the last PG Dynamics that we used on the rack tom. Doesn't have to be exactly the same, so don't fuss over it too much. Okay, so the expander and gate and the compressor are both set. Let's just listen to it and we'll see. We'll actually add the rack tom and the floor tom together. Okay. Yep, I think those sound great. And I'll also add in the overheads to make sure that they're in the right place in the stereo image. Yeah, I'd say those are great. Okay, so we have now basically completed all of the plugin processing that we want to put on these tracks. And so now I'm going to just solo all of the drum stems and not add in the instruments yet. And let's listen to how that sounds. Okay, so I like that drum sound a lot. Let's bring in the other instruments and listen to what it sounds like all together. Thank you for watching this Producer Secrets video on mixing drum stems in Band in a Box. I hope that it has helped you develop a foundation in mixing drums and that you can add your own creative touch from here. As I said before, I encourage you to do different things with these drums. Try different plugins and effects. Export them to your favorite DAW. The sky is the limit, so have fun.